Well, looks like most everybody found their way to where they're headed. We're going to be in John chapter 11. John chapter 11. That's what we're going to look at tonight. We're looking this evening at the miracle that is. We've been looking at the remarkable miracles of Christ, and this one is certainly one of those, and it's the raising of Lazarus from the dead in John chapter 11, and it's one of the most remarkable because he's raising the dead, and then not only that, as we'll see as it unfolds, that he'd been dead for 4 days before he raises him, and so it's kind of hard to fake that one. I mean, if you were ever going to be a critic or a non-believer and look at this, being dead a few minutes would be one thing, but dead for 4 days, that's a different thing entirely. And so that's what he does in this circumstance. And so anyway, this is like I say, the miracle we're going to look at tonight. And it begins, we want to read the first, we're going to skip down through things because there's 50-some verses in this chapter, so we're not going to really cover every single verse. We wouldn't have time to. But just quickly starting out in the beginning of the chapter and looking at the setting, it says, "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill." Now, this that he's referring to about her anointing him and wiping his feet with her hair, that doesn't take place till the next chapter. That's in chapter 12, and that is in response to what Jesus does in chapter 11. John is simply identifying who Mary is and who Martha and Lazarus are. And so anyway, and just as a side note, in Luke 16, there is the account of the rich man and Lazarus have nothing to do with each other. They're not the same situation, not the same Lazarus at all, just the same name. Just for clarification, in case you ever wondered, the rich man and Lazarus, that in Luke 16, Lazarus in that story is a very poor individual. This Lazarus, however, is not. And so, anyway, and part of how you know he's not poor, because when Mary pours that perfume upon Jesus, it is a perfume that they said cost a year's worth of wages. And, that's a tremendous amount to be spending on perfume. And so obviously they had to be individuals of means to be able to buy such a thing and then, pour that upon Christ. Anyway, all right, into this chapter again. He hears that Lazarus is ill. Verse 3, "So the sisters sent to him, saying, 'Lord, he whom you love is ill.' When Jesus heard it, he said, 'This illness will not lead to death, for it is to the glory of God, so that the Son of Man may be glorified through it.' Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after that he said to his disciples, 'Let us go to Judea again.' The disciples said to him, 'Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and yet you are going there again?' Jesus answered, 'Are there not 12 hours in a day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I will go and waken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he'll recover." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant he's taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." So this is what's going on, that Jesus hears that Lazarus is very sick, and he hears by way of his two sisters, Martha and Mary, that the one that they love is sick and that he is very ill, and send for him or let him know that. And so Jesus' response is, this is not going to end in death. And so he almost, when you look at what he says, almost kind of has a cavalier attitude about it, like, it's going to be okay. And he's saying that because he knows how it is going to turn out. And so he says that this is going to turn out so that the glory of God is going to be shown, and so that the Son of Man, or Son of God, may be glorified through it. There's a purpose behind what's going to take place here. And so after hearing that Lazarus is sick, they stay 2 more days where they are. And then after this, he tells his disciples, let's go to Judea. And where he is, it takes a while. Later on in the account, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. So, it's apparently taken a day at least to get word to Jesus. He spends 2 more days, and then it takes a day to get there. And so apparently he may have died just right after they sent word. And so by the time he gets to the tomb and they roll the stone back and Jesus is there, it's been 4 days, that we find out a little later on. But anyway, Jesus said to them, let's go to Judea. And they said, why are we going to go to Judea? Because they just tried to kill you when we were in Judea. They tried to stone you. Jesus gives to them, I think, what you would call a curious response. If you were looking at this, he says, there's 12 hours in a day. If you travel in the day, you can see where you are. And if you travel at night, you'll stumble because the light's not in you. What could that possibly be about? Okay, you only have so much time to do good. I think there's a way that that's true.
God mentioned a little bit about that yesterday. They didn't have lights like we have lights.
Yeah, they didn't have light, so their darkness is going to be dark. We have street lights and stuff. And when I see that and I hear him read that, what I think is this: Jesus is fully aware of what they're trying to do, and he's coming in with his eyes open. He's coming in fully aware. He knows they're out to get him. And so he's going in there in the broad daylight knowing that what they're up to. And so he's walking in with his eyes open in the daylight. And so it's not like he's going in there unaware, uninformed, and not paying attention to what's going on. And then when they realize, he says this to them, that Lazarus has fallen asleep and I need to go wake him up. And then they say, well, if that's all it is, he'll wake up on his own. And Jesus can no longer soften what's happened, maybe so to speak. And he tells them plainly, Lazarus is dead. Lazarus has died. And for your sake, and this is another really curious thing, isn't it? For your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there. Well, what do you think about that? That Jesus is saying, for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there to heal him. Or wasn't there. Okay, he can up the bar significantly because, if he'd been there and healed them, well, they'd seen him do that kind of thing many times. And so he says, for your benefit, I'm glad I wasn't there. Well, Jesus was not going to let him die right in front of his eyes. And so in order for the 4 days to take place, Jesus had to proverbially drag his feet to get there. Because as soon as he got there, he wasn't going to wait any longer to bring him to health and to heal him. And so for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. What you've noticed, and we've already looked at many of these signs in the book of John, you'll notice that Jesus, like we looked last week, he had power over nature to say, peace be still, and to walk on the water. He had power over, to feed the 5,000, and power over, that. And so he's had the power to heal diseases and to walk on water, power over nature. There is not an avenue that Jesus is not all-powerful. He is able to be over and in charge of all those things. And now he's going to show them just how much power he has, in the sense that he's able to show he has power over death. And is going to exert that power. And so he is going to do that. And he's telling them that he's died, and we need to go, and you should be fortunate, or realize you're fortunate, because I wasn't there. And so Thomas, who often gets labeled as Doubting Thomas, does make a pretty strong statement of faith in this instance. Doubting Thomas because he's the one that doubted that Jesus had resurrected. He said, unless I touch his hands in his side, I'll not believe. Well, here he says, let us all go so that we may die with him. Now, before you get too far into saying, wow, what courage and faith, he does have courage and faith, but he also probably should recognize that Jesus could protect them if they needed that. And so, yes, we're going to go die with him, but yet they should have faith to understand that Jesus has called them for a purpose that they haven't fulfilled just yet. And that, anyway, but it does show courage and faith that he's willing to go and encourage all the rest of them to let's go with him, and we'll go where he goes. Any questions or comments to the first 16 verses? All right. Jesus came along, and he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. He had already died and had been buried for 4 days. And Bethany was near Jerusalem. It's about 2 miles off. There's a hill between Jerusalem and Bethany. Anybody know what the name of that hill is called? Yeah, it's called the Mount of Olives. We'd call it a hill, okay? But it's the Mount of Olives. And so the Mount of Olives is the hill between Jerusalem and Bethany. And so you can immediately see, if Jesus frequently visits Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, how convenient the Mount of Olives is. And there's a garden on the side of the hill of the Mount of Olives called Gethsemane. And where does Jesus go to pray the night before he dies on the cross? But there. It was his normal travel route, but it was also his quiet place. And so he could access that anytime he was either in Bethany or in Jerusalem. And it's only about 2 miles. For people that walked everywhere they went, that's practically next door, for that, considering that it was just there. So, because of that, many of the Jews, verse 19, had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. And so when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, and Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give to you. when you look at this and you realize a little later on that that Mary says very much the same thing to Jesus in verse 32 and 33. That she says basically the same thing. Lord, if you'd been here. I wonder if they said that back and forth to each other. Kind of makes me think that they did. The kind of things that you would say, you know, in that situation, that they would say, if Jesus had only been here, he'd still be alive. And so Martha says this to him and says, if you'd been here, that shows great faith, doesn't it? They knew that Jesus could do something. And then she says, you know, I even now know that God will do whatever you ask. I don't believe that means that she thinks he's going to raise him from the dead, but that she still believes in Jesus. She still believes in him because look at what else is said. Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. And she doesn't jump on the fact that he's speaking to the fact that he's going to rise again in a few minutes. She says, Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. So I don't believe that she thinks that Jesus is going to raise him from the dead. What I believe that statement is that she says, I still believe in you, Jesus. If you were here, he would still be alive. And I still believe in you. I still have faith in you that God listens to what you say. And I'll tell you, that's a pretty powerful statement. Either way you look at that, that's a powerful statement in the middle of that grief to say, Jesus, I still believe in you and that whatever you say, you know, God will do, that God will give according to what you ask. That's powerful. And so, Jesus says he's going to rise again. And she said, I know he's going to rise at the last day of the resurrection. And Jesus says to her in verse 25, and this is one of the I am passages in John. There are several of those in John. In John 10, I am the door. I am the good shepherd. Also in John 10, I'm the light of the world. I am. And then here he is. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe. And she makes the great confession. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. She makes the great confession that the Apostle Peter made in Matthew 16. She made the great confession, I believe you're the Christ. And the Christ is in the Hebrew, would be the Messiah, would be the anointed one, the one anointed by God to be over the people, the Son of God who's coming into the world. And she said, I believe that. And so, when she had said this, she went and then gets her sister and tells her sister that Jesus has come. And of course, what does Mary do? And she runs off and goes to Jesus as well. In verse 32, she runs and falls at the feet of Jesus, saying, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Which is the same thing that Martha had said. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. And then you have the shortest verse in the English Bible. It's not the shortest verse in the Greek Bible. 1 Thessalonians 5:16 is. Rejoice evermore. That's one word in Greek. But in the English Bible, John 11:35 is the shortest verse. And it says, Jesus wept. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. Jesus sees Mary and the other Jews, and he's troubled in his spirit, and he weeps. Why do you suppose he weeps? Why do you suppose? Okay, compassion. I had a friend that had died, what he'd gone through. But shows the human side of him. What's going to happen in, say, 10 minutes, or however long it takes to get there? What's going to happen to all those tears? They may be still having tears, but it's a different emotion, isn't it?
Tears for Lazarus, it's not for Mary and Martha. The sorrow that they're going through.
I think it is. I think it is as all of you've been all saying the things. I think it's all a panorama of it. You know, he's pained over the moment. He sees the hurt of Mary and Martha. It shows his humanity, his compassion, his, you know, and I guess not that he's to blame, but you know, he knows that if he'd been there, he would have kept him from dying and kept that pain from happening. And so he's caught up in all of that. And you know, as our Lord and Savior, he is compassionate and kind in that, and he's drawn into that moment, and he weeps, even though he knows the rest of the story. You know, even though he knows how it's going to turn out, he is able to feel in that moment to the extent that he weeps along with them. And so the people, a lot of them are moved to say, see how he loved him. But then there's some others, verse 37, and we don't know about their motivation in saying this. I think this may be some sarcasm. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Whether that's sarcasm or whether that is, yeah, he probably could have saved this man. Or maybe they've heard what Mary and Martha said, or whatever it is, and it may very well be that sarcasm. Maybe they're hecklers like the Pharisees and Sadducees. And so, much like those that looked at him on the cross and say, he saved others, why can't he save himself? And it may well be that. We don't really know the context of why they said that, but some recognize the compassion he has, whereas others, they're criticizing or whatever it is they're doing. And so verse 38, it says of him, he says, deeply moved again. And Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. And it was a cave, and a stone lay against it, much like the picture we have of the tomb that Jesus eventually would be in which there was a stone put in its place. And Jesus said, take away the stone. Now, could Jesus have moved the stone himself? But he has them do what they can do. You want to say something, Kathy? Yeah.
Maybe Christ was crying because we each of us face death once, but Lazarus was going to face death twice. And from the context of this family, they were God-fearing. Lazarus had been carried by angels.
Yeah, Lazarus would.
Back to the world that.
Yeah, there's a very real thing that, Lazarus was already on the other side. Lazarus was already safe with God. And so now he was going to come back to this world. We often, when we lose a loved one, we console ourselves with the fact that they're in a better place than we are. And we will often say things like, well, we sorely miss them, but we wouldn't want them to come back to this mess. And so, there's an element in which, Jesus may be, in a way, mourning for what Lazarus has gone through and what he's going to be put through coming back. And so there's certainly that element, at least there in that.
Wasn't he pursued also by the Jews?
Yeah, in a little while he's going to be, Yeah, they're going to try to kill him as well. In chapter 12 we see that. Yeah, it's part of the rest of that. But Jesus Jesus is going to raise him from the dead, but there's enough people there they can move the stone. And so he asked them to move the stone back. And so they have to exert some effort and some faith. But what response does he get? Martha, the sister of the dead man, says, what does she say? He's going to stink. See, again, this is another reason why I don't think she believed he was going to raise him from the dead. You know, I believe that her statement of faith is maybe even stronger in the sense that she still believes in him even though Jesus, and her perception, let her down. But she said, I still believe that whatever you ask of the Lord, He'll give to you. That's a strong statement of faith when her brother had died and she doesn't believe he's going to raise till the resurrection. And now she says, well, there's a smell after 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. So people moved the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, he prays. You could probably argue that really all of Jesus' miracles were miracles of prayer. But he takes a moment and prays a prayer. Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. Now, if you've ever heard of Marshall Keeble and Marshall Keeble's sermons, one of the most famous things that Marshall Keeble ever preached in the sermon was the fact of why Jesus said, Lazarus, come out. He said, so I suppose if he hadn't gotten specific, the whole cemetery would have come out. So if he hadn't said anything but Lazarus come out, the whole grave would come out. One of the best treats this last year at Polishing the Pulpit, there is a preacher, Eric Owens. He's a really good speaker. I'll have to try to find and get a DVD of his sometimes if we've got any of his. His would be really good for the Sunday nights when we do those. And Eric Owens did what I would classify as a dramatic reading of one of Marshall Keeble's sermons, because he's reading the text of his sermon. And so he tried as best he could to get into the persona and the aura which he spoke that. And they did that this year at Polishing the Pulpit, and it was the sermon that was in. And so I was like, okay, I could tell it was coming. So I knew that was the case. And so what a powerful thought that is, that if Jesus hadn't gotten specific and said Lazarus, then the whole cemetery would have emptied out. And so it says in verse 44, the man who had died came out. But get this picture. A real live mummy comes out. Because look at this. His hands and his feet are bound with linen strips, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Now that sure sounds like a mummy to me, doesn't it you? Yeah, completely covered in rags and cloths. You know, that for Halloween, that's a pretty neat picture to think of. You know, that he comes out bound completely in linen strips, completely bound with the cloth. And so what does Jesus say? He comes out with all of that on him. Okay? He comes out of the grave with all of that on him, and he tells them, unbind him and let him go. He comes out with all of that on and says, go help the man. You know, help him get out of that stuff. And so here he comes out. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. Well, you'd imagine they would, wouldn't you? But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, I'll get what they said here in a minute. My good feeling is these people don't go because they're trying to stir up trouble for Jesus. I have to wonder if these people went with good intentions. That they see what happened, and they go to the Pharisees and say, you would not believe what Jesus did this time. He raised a man from the dead, raised Lazarus from the dead, and he'd been in there 4 days. And when they cracked open that tomb, whoo, wow, it smelled. And he said, Lazarus, come out, and he did. And he came out wrapped in that, and they told about what he had done. And so I just have to think, in a way, that they did so trying to convince the Pharisees of what Jesus was about. So I don't know that they necessarily brought to them something to be negative, because they go with a true report, but the way that the chief priests and the Pharisees take it. Let's see what they say. Verse 4.
Natural thing to witness what they just witnessed and won't tell everybody they saw.
Oh yeah, and to tell people that have been wavering on the fence and saying, hey, if what's happened before hasn't convinced you, this will. And so they go to them and say, you wouldn't believe what happened. So in verse 47, so the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. They are acknowledging that he is performing these signs. Yeah, Tom?
Every time I've ever read this, I can hardly believe that some of these people were overcome by fear when they saw that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
I know I would.
might have had to raise a few more folks from the dead after that. Yeah. It'd have been something to see that. I always kind of picture those, like I said, it's a real live mummy. I just kind of picture those mummy movies where he's coming out of the tomb there, because, he's all wrapped like that. That's what he'd have to look like, but, he may not have his arms stretched out like they do in the movies, but he's wrapped and he's covered up with all of that. Yeah, we don't know about that. Yeah, that's a whole different line of thinking. Yeah, it would have been nice to have known what he thought about those 4 days. But oh yeah, for sure. He'd want us to know he'd be in there. But what are we to do? Verse 44, for this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, I just love this. I just love this. The sermon they're preaching here. If we let him go on like this, everybody will believe in him. Well, isn't that the idea? If we let him go on like this, everybody will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. I just love it how that when the Pharisees, they come to a conclusion that usually their conclusion is correct, but how they take that conclusion and what they do with it is so wrong. They have come to the conclusion that everybody's going to believe this. Well, then why don't they either believe it or try to investigate further? Instead, they get concerned about their place, their position, their power, their influence. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, and here he does, he tells them, and what does he do? He thinks he's given some great advice to get rid of things, but you know what he's doing? He's prophesying and doesn't even know it. He's making a prophecy about what's going to take place, even though he was not wise enough to know what he was really saying. He says, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. Well, you know what? That's exactly right. Verse 51, he did not say this on his own accord, but being the priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. And not only for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad, so that from that day on they made plans to put him to death. So that's their reaction to what he did. They've been angered with him and everything, but now they're doing all they can to put him to death. And so they've taken Caiaphas' word, and they've decided they're going to do all they can to put him to death. They said, it's better that he die than all of us get destroyed. Now they do this with an attempt to save their nation, to save their city and their nation. Well, you know what? It's just about 40 years later that Jerusalem gets destroyed in AD 70. And in just a little less than 40 years, it gets destroyed anyway. And so their attempts to save their nation and save their city, not really going to work in the long run anyway. So Jesus, after this, doesn't walk openly among them. He stays on the fringes in the wilderness. And then he's more careful about where he goes. And then you have verse 57 that the Pharisees gave orders that if anybody knew where he was, that they were to tell them. So now they're going to try to find Jesus. And you go over into chapter 12, you find it says 6 days before the Passover, Jesus comes to Bethany. He's back in Bethany before he goes into the Passover. So when does Jesus die on the cross? The Passover, at the Passover feast. And so this is the last week of the life of Christ, 6 days before the Passover. And so this is just less than a week before he dies on the cross that Mary then anoints Jesus with this expensive perfume. We don't have time to look at that as we're right at the end. And then as Mark mentioned a little while ago, that in chapters 9 and 10 of this chapter, it says, then the large crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was there. They came not only on account of him, but they want to see Lazarus. Lazarus is now a spectacle, and they want to see him, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. There is no indication that Lazarus ever was killed again after that, but that Lazarus died a natural death. Some people wonder why John records about Lazarus and not Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you know, because something as amazing as that, you'd think that maybe they would all record it, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote their gospel accounts first. And it's quite possible that Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote their accounts while Lazarus was still alive. John, however, writing his book so much later, the idea may be that he had already passed away and therefore would not bring any more problems for him in that. I don't know whether that's the case or not, but it makes sense to me at least that could be. And part of the reason why they maybe didn't include him is to make him more of a target. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not record it. Only John did. And so anyway, you look at that and you see that. But it is one of the most amazing miracles that we find in Scripture. And so he raises him from the dead. And you know, even the miracle is what's is amazing, but the compassion and the way that Jesus is moved and the way that Jesus weeps for his friend and his, Mary and Martha. That also, I think, is very telling about our Lord and Savior and the way that He was, the way that He lived, and the way that He acted. I think it's very telling about that. Any last questions or comments? Yes, Tom?
I often wonder about these things, and I know it's trivial. I don't call faith healers, I call faith healers. But when they do that today in this faith, they lay hands on someone, normally. Now, Jesus and the apostles, to me, more so just spoke and said,
True. And how much faith did Lazarus have? There again, another instance. The man at Bethesda that we looked at a few weeks ago, he didn't think Jesus was going to heal him. He said, nobody's here to help me get into the water. And Jesus, tells him to get up and helps him to his feet, and he's healed. And so, he didn't show any faith. And here Lazarus didn't have any faith. The faith has always been what matters about the healer, not the one being healed. The healer is the one that has to have the most faith. They have to have the faith. And if the healer has the faith, it doesn't matter what condition the person to be healed is in. They could be dead like Lazarus. Yes, Kathy?
John himself gives us a little bit of insight into why different miracles and different instances are recorded in his very last verse when he says, there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which, if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the book.
Yeah, it's the last verse of the Gospel of John, yeah. Yeah, the very last of it, yeah. And of course, the chapter previous to that, go ahead and hit the buzzer. The chapter previous to that is that Jesus did many other things in the presence of His disciples, but these things are written that you might believe and have life in His name. And that's John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31 there. So yeah, those things are all about what He did. Next week, we are going to look at Luke chapter, I just had it there a second ago. Let me get it real quick. We're going to look at Luke 17. We're going to look at the 10 lepers, at Jesus cleansing the 10 lepers and healing them. And we're going to do what we did. We're going to do what we did here a few weeks ago. We're going to also cover when Jesus healed the man in Matthew chapter 8 of leprosy. He heals one right after the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 8. It is a short one. And then also the 10 lepers in Luke chapter 17. So those two miracles are similar enough, being lepers, that we'll look at those two together. So Matthew 8, the beginning of it, and then Luke 17, those are the ones we're going to look at next week. Thank you. Okay. Just a couple moments, we're going to sing the invitation song. Tonight we looked at John chapter 11. We looked at the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Shortly after Lazarus was raised from the dead, in fact, just a couple days later, or shortly thereafter, it's still 6 days before the Passover that Mary anoints Jesus with the perfume and washes his feet with her hair. And then they decide that they're going to try to kill Lazarus also. And so this is going on. Well, and here it is, this last week before Jesus does die on the cross. In chapter 12, verse 12,